Thank you for that, Travis. So I'm Patrick Nehring. I'm a community development educator or professor in Brown County and Kewaunee County, Wisconsin Extension for UW-Madison. Joining me in the room here is my colleague who just started last week as a community garden coordinator. Our previous community garden coordinator was on the list as one of the presenters, but she was unable to make it today with her new career opportunities she's pursuing. So that would be Aubrey Fliss. I'm going to have my fellow presenters introduce themselves, and then we'll start with the presentation. So I'll turn it over to Josset.
Yeah, I'll go first. Hi, everyone. God, what a turnout. This is great. I see people represented from everywhere from North Dakota to Bangladesh. So an international crowd, very cool. I'm Josset Gauley. I'm an evaluation specialist at University of Wisconsin Extension.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Leslie Quevedo. I am a community youth development educator in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with the Division of Extension. I work with young people in garden spaces across the county, and therefore intersect greatly with our community garden and urban agriculture program, and help to lead the ripple effect mapping effort here in Milwaukee County.
And joining us is Connor, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. My name's Connor Avery. I am going into my third season growing as a part of the Milwaukee County Community Garden Network, and such an honor to be here this afternoon. Thank you.
So we have a presentation for you this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. And then that'll be available after we present here too. So we are from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension. And we're looking at the community garden. We were looking at the community garden impacts. We wanted to know what the impact of the community gardens were in Wisconsin. Extension has involvement in community gardens across the state. And for most of the state, the community garden involvement is a small part of what the Extension office does. Brown County and Milwaukee County are larger counties, and the community gardens are larger in these two counties. And so we took a look at what the impact of the community gardens are for Milwaukee County, which has the largest acreage of community garden space available. And then we looked at Brown County, which has the greatest number of gardens in the community garden program. To look at this, we used a focus group process called ripple effect mapping. It is a nice process that engages participants to tell their story. So we're learning from them the impacts that the community gardens are having, and the ripple effect mapping, Josset is going to explain in a few minutes, but it's a way of us having our participants tell their story and how the community gardens have impacted themselves and how it's impacted the larger community. And we used this process because we felt it was a good way of engaging people and learning the indirect impacts that community gardens have.
All right. So to begin today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the method of ripple effects mapping, just to give you a pretty basic understanding of how you facilitate one of these sessions and some of the benefits of using it. Like any evaluation tool, you want to make sure that the method you use is going to match what you want to know. And for our main question, which was looking at long-term impacts of community garden spaces and how that's affected people, and entire communities, we decided this was a good fit. So ripple effects mapping is a participatory approach. It's very grounded in the experience of the individuals or organizations who partner with Extension and experience our education that we provide. It's very valuable for helping to understand how specific outcomes are attributed to specific programming. Attribution is key in being able to understand whether or not the work that we do is making a difference. And so this process helps to tease out how those outcomes are attributed to our programming and not some external factor, at least at the very basic level. It also, through the process, it helps us understand causal connections between outcomes. So we can, and from the perspective of a participant in our programming. So we're able to understand how a person's mental health is affected by their time in the garden and our programming, as well as how their mental health is associated with another impact on them, like, I don't know, just being more connected to their community or caring more about their community. And finally, ripple effects mapping is really useful for understanding long-term program impacts. I hear from a lot of our extension educators in Wisconsin who often are skeptical of doing evaluation of their programs because they realize that the impacts of their work may not be realized for many years. And this method is very powerful in helping to tease out what those long-term impacts are, not just for the people who participated, but for entire communities. There is a fantastic resource that was developed by Extension evaluators and educators, Scott Chasden, Mary Emery, Deborah Hansen, Lori Higgins, and Rebecca Ciro a few years ago, and that's available free online, and there's a link to that in our presentation that we'll send out. And I strongly encourage you to dig in deeper into that. You can move on to the next slide, Patrick. So ripple effects mapping is, it's a method that's strongly associated with systems approaches to understanding impacts. And in particular, two frameworks really help inform ripple effects mapping. So there's the social or human ecological model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the idea behind that is that individuals are nested and impacts on individuals are nested in the greater context of where they live and who they work with and who they're associated with. And then on another framework that's very strongly associated with ripple effects mapping is the community capitals framework, in which the idea is that it takes 7 different types of capital to make a vibrant community. And so ripple effects mapping really emerged based on these frameworks. And I say that just as some background in that this approach, this method is designed to understand impacts in complex systems. Next, Patrick. And so if we think about systems thinking, we're thinking about how educational programs or opportunities provided through extension are impacting all levels of a system. So not just the individual, but the people that those individuals interact with, the organizations those people interact with, and then even, going out entire communities and the vibrancy of those communities. So with a community garden, typically in a system, we want to understand what does the community garden mean to you as an individual? Is it helping you with your mental health? Is it just something you enjoy as a hobby? Is it a way for you to increase social connections? And the answer is we don't know until we actually interact with our participants and ask them. And then we want to take it to the next level and ask those so what questions. So now that we know how it's impacted you as an individual, how has this programming made other differences ballooning out, rippling out into other areas of your life? And then finally, when you complete a full ripple effects map, it helps you as an educator alongside participants to discuss next steps for program improvement. So what can be done to enhance the programming? What did we learn through the conversation we had during the mapping session that could help create a bigger collective vision for the future? So that stuff is usually pretty clear when I talk about ripple effects mapping with folks, is like the basics of the method. But even folks who read the guidebook sort of are like scratching their head saying, well, how do you actually do this? And so I break it up into 4 steps. And this is adapted from Chasden's original model. But it starts with appreciative inquiry. So peer interviews with the people who are in the session. So if Leslie and I were in a session together, we would spend 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning interviewing one another and taking notes on what the other person says. That's step 1. Step 2 then is a collective mapping exercise in which all of the participants, and it's usually between 8 and 10 people, sometimes a few more, they're manipulating the notes they took during the one-on-one interviews and putting them on a map. And the map is designed to show how different outcomes for individuals are related. And so they start to cluster those. And I'll show you this in a minute. The next step is then some further sorting of the outcomes in the map. And we call that participatory data analysis. And then finally, there's some group reflection on next steps. So really the beauty of the ripple effects mapping process is it's allowing participants to tell their story and the impacts on them, and then understand how there are similarities in those impacts on other people. And then finally, and this is the best thing from an evaluation standpoint, once you're done with the REM session, you're essentially done with the analysis. And it's beautiful because the analysis is being done together with the extension expert and with the participants of the program. All right, next. So for this particular project, understanding community garden impacts in both Milwaukee and Brown County, we were focused on learning 3 kind of broad questions around impact. So the first was at that individual level, the center of the circle. So how is that programming affecting the people who participate? Beyond that, we wanted to know how that was making our communities better in general. So like, because of people participating in the programming, what else has changed in that community? What's changed about the context, and how did those changes occur? And then finally, and this was something we've been looking for a long time, is understanding that broader impact on families, organizations, and communities, and really understanding how that resource is a critical resource in our communities. Next one, Patrick. So when we started our session, we start with appreciative inquiry. And this is the set of questions we gave our participants to do in peer interviews with one another. And so as you read through this, you can see we're asking people to do an initial kind of brainstorm about the individual impacts and some of the broader, more rippled impacts. And we typically give people 15 minutes to do these one-on-one interviews with one another. And during that process, as you interview the other person, you're writing down the outcomes on Post-it notes or these sticky notes. And these are critical to the process, at least the way I do it. So that's the starting point. Next one, Patrick. So once the peer interviews are done, it's really when the fun begins, because everyone has their own data written down on the Post-its. And you spend the next 45 minutes to an hour in groups, grouping similar outcomes together, using arrows and drawings, and it's whatever people want to use. There's no rules really. They're mapping out the theory of change. So from their experience in the garden to other ripples and other aspects of their lives. At the end of that 45 minutes or so, you sort of come to a consensus, and you kind of step back from the map and say, hey, are these the outcomes we're seeing? And it becomes very clear very quickly that, you know, the 3 to 5 to 10 outcomes that resulted from the garden. Next one, Patrick. And so here's sort of how it looks. You can imagine a piece of like chart paper or several pieces of chart paper tied together with sticky notes all over it. And at the center of the map is the intervention, the educational intervention or the resource that everyone who's in the group has experienced. And they start with talking about the individual level outcomes that they had. And then they're moving towards the sort of outer ring. So as a result of learning new ways to deal with pest management in the garden, then what happened? And then as a result of that, then what happened? So it's a constant game of, okay, that happened, then what? Because of that, that happened. And so again, we're mapping out a whole theory of change. Next one. And so here's a completed map. This is not from one of our gardens, but it's from another University of Wisconsin program. But as you can see here, this is a final map that a group created, and each outcome chain, so from the individual level impacts to more community level impacts as you get further out on the map, and each outcome is color coded. And so this one is more about technology and impacts on communication. This whole one is more about some environmental impacts. This one has some transportation and housing impacts. So at the end of this is after 2 hours with these folks. They have mapped out and evaluated and shown the impacts of that program at multiple levels, and shown how that programming makes a difference in a complex system. And so with that background, I will turn it over to Leslie, I think, or maybe Patrick, to talk about the specific things that we found through this process in Milwaukee.
Thanks, Josset.
Hey, Leslie, we had a question in the chat about what is your definition of a community garden? So I thought maybe
yes, I saw that. Okay. And I don't have a technical definition, but I can talk about what it means here in Milwaukee County. Our community garden program is basically a series of organized spaces across the county that are divided into individual growing plots of various sizes, including, up to quarter-acre micro farms that are available to community members at low-cost rental fees. Majority of the plots are seasonal rental, so new gardeners can, have their pick every year or come back from year to year. We do have a handful of permanent plots at a few of our sites, which means that gardeners maintain their plots throughout the entire annual cycle. We do not till, we do not go into their plots, and that allows kind of the longer term gardeners to build up infrastructure and kind of plan out over the longer term of their plots. So I hope that answers, at least on a basic level, the question of what it means here in Milwaukee County. And a little bit of background our program here, we have 10 community garden sites across the county. This is as of 2022, this past growing season. We have a total of 78 acres of growing space. And that includes our largest space, which is out on our county line with the next county. That's about 46 acres. And so that's where a lot of our micro farmers are, and farm to market farmers that come back year after year. In 2022, we rented a total of 1,043 plots, which was actually only about 65% of our total rental capacity. We're going through some transitions and have some work to do to get that up closer to 100% so that all of our land is being utilized. And again, in 2022, that meant 450 families were renting plots. Emphasis on families, because what we see is that it's a multi-generational effort and activity in a lot of our spaces, where families, 3 generations often, are renting plots next to each other, or swapping out year after year, and engaging in the work and gardening together. We also have partnerships with a handful of community-based organizations at a few of our sites, and they have permanent growing spaces where they've actually been able to develop longer-term infrastructure, some outbuildings and storage places and gathering spaces that they utilize not just for growing food, but to have ceremony and participation with the communities that they serve. Next slide. So the ripple effect mapping process here in Milwaukee County, we chose 3 of our 10 gardens to focus on for this effort, meaning we had an event for each of them, 3 separate ripple effect mapping events. The gardens were selected based on the sheer number of people that were engaged, or families that were engaged in those spaces, and for longer periods of time. We also wanted to tap into the great diversity that exists within our growing spaces. Definitely the Hmong population here in Milwaukee County has a very strong presence in our gardeners, and we wanted to make sure that we captured as many diverse perspectives and thoughts as possible. And also wanted to make sure that we involved those community-based organizations that have a longer term presence and maybe some different desired outcomes in their work within our gardens. So 3 different events on 3 different days. We made sure that we held the events at times that were made sense for the gardeners for that event. And also that they were in easy to locate, accessible locations, ideally closer to the gardening space that they work in, but really make this a friendly event. We provided a meal, which was before the actual event. So that created a really nice opportunity to kind of strengthen our community, get to know each other, develop some bonds before we entered into the process, which is a very collaborative and engaging process. And that really helped to kind of foster the environment and the space that we wanted to create for a successful event. We also provided translation services. Again, with our Hmong population, we wanted to make sure that, and also our Spanish-speaking population, that, it was an accessible event for everyone. And what really helped to make this work is that, for evaluation purposes, is that the ripple effect mapping process helped us to engage audiences that could be difficult to reach through other means. So, sending out a survey via email works for some, but not for a lot. And so the participatory aspect of this really engaged audiences and made it, more successful. What we found some anticipated, some not, was that it further engaged and connected audience members in unexpected ways. A lot of that, and I'll talk a little bit about this later when we talk about the results, but it led to new relationships, deepened relationships, not only between extension colleagues that were participating and leading the event, but also between the gardeners who maybe had seen each other, but then were able to develop more direct connections, and also with programming. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but we were able to engage with gardeners and get them involved in some deeper work that we're doing, and have some mutually beneficial relationships that came out of the process. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick to talk about Brown County.
So it started with Milwaukee County, and I had been working in Milwaukee and Brown County at that time. And Brown County doesn't have quite the number of acres in the community garden program, but they do have more gardens. There's 14 community gardens in Brown County. This coming year, there'll be 15. There's 250 gardeners within the gardens in Brown County. And there's a waiting list for the garden plots that are available. So the Brown County is actively looking for additional garden space. Most of the gardens in Brown County, it's a little bit different in Milwaukee County, in that most of the gardens in Brown County are donated land that may be used for another resource in the future for by the landowner, but for a time period, they're willing to have a community garden occupy that space. And similar to in Milwaukee, a community garden is set up in the same way, that it's divided up. The property is divided up into smaller lot plots, sometimes raised beds, sometimes on the ground, and gardeners take that plot to grow what they would like in that space. The community garden program tills it and maintains it to that extent, but then the gardeners maintain it throughout the course of the summer growing season, and then at the end of the year, the plot is tilled again, and they can rent it again for the next year. There aren't very many permanent gardens in Brown County. So in Brown County, the ripple effect mapping was used similar to Milwaukee County. It was a way of engaging the gardeners, and then Brown County had recently located to a new building on the UW Green Bay campus. So the ripple effect mapping sessions, the two that were held at the Brown County STEM Innovation Center on the campus. And that was an opportunity to show off what Extension has to offer beyond the community gardens. Also, we had a new community garden coordinator, and this was an opportunity for us to introduce her and for her to connect with those gardeners. And similar to Milwaukee, there are gardeners that have different language expectations or different language abilities. And so we were able to invite the gardeners in English, Spanish, and Hmong, and we provided some simultaneous interpretation through Extension, through the technology that we had available through our Extension interpretation offices. And the results of the community garden ripple effect mapping in Brown County was similar to what it was in Milwaukee County. And that was part of what was the motivation for looking at Brown County in addition to Milwaukee County, was to see if it was something that was unique to Milwaukee County, or if it's something that's unique to community garden.
What is it? This is interesting.
And this is,
That's good.
we found that we had similar results here in Brown County and the same results in Milwaukee County. And Connor's was one of our participants in Milwaukee County, and he's going to talk to us about his experiences.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Connor. I am a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I first found the Milwaukee County Extension Office community garden effort back in 2021. Just wrapped up my second growing season at the Cole Farm Community Garden. It's as Leslie mentioned, one of the largest gardens in the county. I'm fortunate enough to have a 1/4 acre plot that I've been using to experiment and expand my cut flower growing efforts. Back in 2020, flower growing and gardening was kind of a backyard quarantine project, and I was looking for room to expand and grow and continue to experiment with this new endeavor, and stumbled upon the extension office, and never beyond my wildest dreams would I imagine that I would have the opportunity to have this amount and quality of land to do this. So grateful to have that opportunity. My business, Coppins & Co. Cut Flowers, for the past 2 seasons, I've been providing primarily to local Milwaukee wedding florists and designers. Patrick, if you want to jump to that next slide. The crops that I'm growing right now, specializing in dahlias, zinnias, and cosmos primarily. Some easy to grow cut flowers coming in a lot of different varieties. And this is really just a side passion project that has started to blossom into this secondary business. It's just so exciting for me to see these blooms get utilized in local weddings, high-end events, and seeing the joy that the flowers bring, not just to me, but to so many people. The next slide shows kind of the impact that I've been experiencing with building these florist connections across southeastern Wisconsin. This past season, I was working with about 12 local florists, and they were taking all my blooms, which was great. And the event, the Ripple Effects event that I engaged in a year ago, last fall, is where I first met Josset and Leslie. And through that opportunity, Leslie got me connected with her community engagement efforts, and had a group of from 2 local youth groups come out to participate in a cut flower hands-on experience to share blooms and joy with those local youth groups. And then overall too, I'm really grateful for the Ripple Effects mapping experience. It was a really clarifying and thought-provoking way to reflect on my first season. I was invited to attend that event at the end of my first growing season, and didn't know quite what to expect, and then went, and it was so powerful to have time to really think about what that garden had meant to me, and what it has meant to others. Patrick, if you want to jump to the next slide for me. And just a way to help clarify those thoughts, and see the different levels of the benefits of not just me and my family, but the clients that I'm providing for, their brides and families and clients that these flowers are getting used for. For me, it's really created a new sense of well-being, and increased by mental and physical health, an enhanced connection to nature. I live in a small apartment in Milwaukee, and then just can drive 15 minutes and be at this 1/4 acre plot that feels like I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's new sanctuary, and kind of an increased sense of ownership that is really allowed me to dream bigger about what the possibilities of this venture could be in the future. As I mentioned, I am an architecture student as well. So how do I blend these passions of architecture, flower growing, photography into a sustainable business for my future? So, and I wouldn't have had that without this map. This is a picture from that mapping session last year. And I was writing Post-its like crazy because as you're going through that, you start to think of things that you don't get a sense of right away as you're experiencing them on the day-to-day. So getting to hear from your neighbors and the other growers and gardeners, it prompts all these new connections, and you start to see those ripples and the impacts and the connections with the fellow participants. Paul and Dee Dee, who run our community vet garden, they gave me a rain barrel this past season. So the friendships that have blossomed from that, I'm just so grateful. And yeah, it's been a really incredible experience.
Thanks, Connor. So much of what you say just makes me smile, and your photos too. So thanks for sharing. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the outcomes and impacts that we discovered through this effort. And bring a little bit of context to it. You know, we can read about these things, but I also want to just share some examples of things that came out, you know, from the actual gardeners, and share their stories as well. So overwhelmingly, physical and mental health benefits. Connor talked about that, and that was an overwhelmingly common response from the gardeners. You know, eating the food, being out in nature, you know, the exercise, stress reduction, especially, you know, we did this last fall of 2021. So we were all just kind of like crawling out of a, you know, multi-year quarantine. And so many of the gardeners indicated that this really, you know, the community gardens really was, you know, just a savior during that very difficult time that we all went through. There was a single mother that attended one of the events, and she lives kind of in the heart of a more challenged neighborhood in Milwaukee, and really appreciated gardening with her adolescent son, and talked about how it was just a safe space to get away from, you know, a community that was plagued, you know, is plagued with, you know, violence and just, you know, some of the challenges from that exist in her community. And that it was really a place to connect with her son, that she, in a way that she wouldn't have been able to otherwise in kind of the places, you know, that they normally live in and exist. So that safe space to connect with loved ones really is an important part of the mental health component. Strengthening social networks, building community, learning from others, sharing cultural traditions, growing techniques and tools, and then, you know, making connections beyond the garden. As Connor said, because of, you know, and that goes for Extension too. So by participating in it as a staff member with Extension, you know, I met Connor, and he, you know, is now working with young people, hopefully again next summer, and showing them kind of the entrepreneurship side of gardening and allowing them to cut beautiful flowers and take them home to their families. Also connected with another gardener who has a permanent plot, and she wound up becoming an employee and hired to work with the young people as a expert gardener. So totally would not have happened, those kinds of connections, without this event. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Also, kind of an unforeseen aspect of the strengthening of social networks is that gardeners indicated that beyond the garden, there's the connections that happen in the garden with the people that you see on a regular basis. And then by growing an abundance of food and taking it back into their communities, the food that they grew became, and the excess, sharing of the excess food became a vehicle to develop and strengthen networks in their own communities. So Paul and Dee Dee are oversee our Veterans Healing Garden, which is at Cole Farm, and they just grow a ton of food, and they put it out on tables in their front yard, and their neighbors have come to rely on them and to know them. And without that food and access to their excess produce, they wouldn't necessarily meet as many people in their community. So again, that ripple effect. Also, as say this on the extension side, by participating in this and hearing firsthand the impact that these gardens have on the gardeners and the space, and the importance and the value they place on that, really helped us to realize that we have an army of supporters. We have, 450 families, and most of them, I'm sure, so many indicated a willingness to help. How can I help? How can I support what you're doing? Or offer expertise, in marketing or, graphic design or photography or things like that. So really tapping into, from an extension side, this great network of people that are willing to help. Pathway to Agricultural Entrepreneurship. Connor is, the perfect example, and there's a handful of others, especially, farm to market. Farmers that are selling at multiple farmers markets on a weekly basis as a form of income. We have a handful of flower farmers who, in addition to Connor, indicated that without access to this low cost land and the infrastructure, meaning the water and kind of the tilling and the maintenance, they wouldn't have their business, that their business would not, their small business would not be possible at this point in its evolution. And so really supporting that entrepreneurship aspect. And then understanding and appreciating culture and traditions. The best example is the Gerald L. Ignace Indian Health Center, which is a local nonprofit here in Milwaukee servicing our Native population. They have a permanent space at one of our gardens where they have, seasonal ceremonies. They grow produce with their participants. They actually started a, I'm losing the words. But it's like a prescription produce program as part of their health center, where they they bring people that are suffering from various health challenges into the gardens to either grow their own food or have access to healthy produce and help them to prepare it. So next slide. Patrick, were you taking this one?
Should have learned to unmute by now, but so that fostering partnerships not only was with extension, but between gardeners. And so we had examples of gardeners who made connections with local organizations and making connections with other gardeners, and ways of participating. And some of the gardeners had used them as business references, and the gardeners have provided local organizations with flowers and produce. In Brown County, over 8,000 pounds of produce was donated to the local food pantries. In Milwaukee County, around 140 gardeners donated vegetables to others in Milwaukee County. So the community gardens provide an opportunity not only for the gardeners, but also fostering partnerships with organizations. There's also been a greater appreciation and understanding of the natural environment through the gardening process. And in the urban communities, there is still a lot of wildlife available and can be. So some of that is good for the garden, and some of it is just in that you have the bugs and worms and so on that help the gardens. It's an opportunity to be out in nature and to view the birds and other animals that may not be as obvious to you. And then you also have interactions with deer and rabbits. And so many of the community gardens do have substantial fences around them to keep those particular animals out of the garden. But there's an opportunity to see the nature and experience it directly. There's also been cost savings that gardeners have experienced. In Brown County, we also did a survey in addition to the ripple effect mapping. 50% of the households that participated in the gardens indicated that 50% of their household budget for produce is coming through the growing of vegetables in their gardens. So that's helping out their personal income and their household budgets. And then extension, what extension brings to the community gardens really makes a difference. Extension not only rents the garden spaces and provides makes arrangements for water to be available, tills the sites in a few cases, and manages the gardens from a physical standpoint, but also provides educational resources and information on how to garden in different ways. It makes a connection to other extension programs that we have, and gardeners now have an opportunity to participate in those other extension opportunities. So we would like to know, you can put it in the chat too, is how could you use ripple effect mapping for some of your extension programs that you provide? And then we're also open to taking the questions that you may have put in the chat. And so,
and Patrick, before that, I want to make another couple points.
Sure.
So we came into this process in Milwaukee, at least, with a kind of a sense of urgency, and probably something that a lot of you around the country experience is extension can be on the chopping block with county boards sometimes. And so we came into this with a need to demonstrate to the county board that these community garden spaces were a critical community resource. And through this process, we were able to identify the outcomes that we expected to see. So things like improved social networks, improved mental health, improved physical health. But we also found these really cool, more emergent outcomes that we never could have guessed, like that these gardens were a pathway to entrepreneurship, or these were fostering relationships between diverse cultures. So really cool information that emerged. And as a result, after reading our report, that county board approved the purchase of a new tractor for coal farms. We were able to hire a new specialist who specializes in community gardens. Leslie was able to connect with new volunteers like Connor. And we were able to hire staff directly from people we interacted with during these sessions. So it really was just a great overall experience and a great case study in what a ripple effects mapping process can show about the value that seemingly small things like, oh yeah, extension has a garden, big deal. It is a big deal, and we showed it by going through this process. So I encourage anyone to do it if it's a method that's going to fit your problem. Sorry, I had to mention the tractor. It was the coolest evaluation outcome ever.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we're retiring our tractor that's older than most of us. So that is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thanks, team.
So-
I did capture some questions from the chat, unless somebody has any, and I'll try to maybe combine some of these into ones that are similar. So one of the questions is, what does it cost to rent a 4th acre lot? And then the other question is sort of who assumes liability on the property for community gardens, as well as who provides water. So how does that, so I guess some logistical things about the gardens that you might have expert tips on.
Sure. I don't have our pricing list at my fingertips. Connor, are you willing to share how much a 1/4 acre costs?
I believe it's 300 for the season. So incredibly reasonable. Where else could you get that deal? And I believe the 30 by 30 plots are 50.
Mhm. For the entire growing season.
Right.
And so in Milwaukee County, our land is in partnership with our county parks department. So I want to say almost all of our growing space is on county parks land. And so we have an MOU with them over the course of, many years that we maintain the land, we provide the water. Obviously we generate revenue with the rental program, and one of the costs is the water. So that is provided as part of the rental fee, as well as annual tilling for the seasonal plots, and other maintenance needs, kind of basic maintenance needs as they come up. Liability, it's a good question. I'm not the expert specifically on, the program overseeing it. So I'm not sure where that lands, but I'm sure it's somewhere deep within the MOU between the County Parks Department and Extension here in Milwaukee County.
And in Brown County, where they are using land that's been donated by another source, sometimes the water is, arrangements are made for the water. Sometimes that's in a tank and sometimes it's available on site. The fees for the garden plots are pretty similar. And that covers the cost of the water, and the tilling is done in Brown County by the Highway Department. And we collect the fees and then pay for a number of make arrangements for that, including the fencing around the gardens is also provided by through the garden program. And the liability is part of the county's liability. So I could exactly tell that what the cost for that, but it's part of the fees for the community garden is the liability insurance that goes along with it.
Okay, so I think these are probably for Josset. So a couple things that showed up in chat were somebody said one of their favorite, most useful probes for appreciative inquiry is asking participants if they could change anything about the situation to create more success as they define it. So they're interested, did your team ask questions similar to this that are maybe future focused lens in the mapping process?
That's a great point. In our process, we were more focused and interested on the impacts, so we didn't really have that conversation about changes. Although I've led ripple effects mapping sessions in the past where once the map is completed, we kind of go back and have that troubleshooting conversation. And again, there really aren't any like hard rules on how to run one of these. So if you're more interested in the program improvement kind of aspects, you can focus your conversation on that. It's a great point.
Okay, and I think maybe a tag on to that is what happens to that information after you do this ripple effect mapping? So
yeah,
what happens to it? What do you do with it?
Yeah, that's the tough thing about ripple effects mapping is you end up with these beautiful participant created outcome maps, theories of change from their perspective. How do you report on that in a way that's going to make sense to various stakeholders in your community? We have an example of the report that we wrote that we will send to everyone who participated today as an example. There are also examples of how to write that up in the field guide to ripple effects mapping that Scott Chasden and colleagues wrote. And I'm happy if you email me to give you other examples, but it is a challenge. Related to that, I saw another comment in the chat from Katerina. Does this method lend itself to statistical analysis? Not necessarily, but I could see where you could possibly make some adaptations to move in that direction. One example is sometimes I'll have, once a full map is completed, I'll have the participants start to rank, order, and prioritize things. You can also have them indicate like a numeric, like a 1 to 10 strength of a relationship between a short-term and a medium-term outcome. So there are ways to sort of get there, but really it's a qualitative method.
Okay, and I think we'll take one more question, and I know there's some in the chat, so I'll capture those as well as you will get all the presenters' email in that presentation when you get the recording. But Bethany had a question about, could you talk a little more about building inclusion for those non-speaking participants?
Leslie, I might turn that over to you and Patrick, because
Sure.
you sort of took the lead on that.
Sure. I mean, I'll be honest and say we knew that, the ripple effect mapping events, 3 events on specific dates at specific times was not going to capture, all the voices that we wanted to include for a number of reasons. And so we did strategize different methods to reach those, to capture those voices. And due to capacity issues, they have not happened yet, but there was a time when, we developed a series of questions and we planned to actually spend time in the garden, Josset, with actually a member of the Hmong Chamber of Commerce, who we have a relationship with here in Milwaukee County. We really wanted to get a strong, presence from the Hmong community out in Cole Farm, because there are so many, and they contribute, such great, great wealth to our community and are very engaged there. And so we had intentions of Josset actually doing one-on-one interviews with a member of the Hmong Chamber of Commerce as a translator and capturing that through individual interviews. Due to capacity issues, it hasn't happened yet, but we're constantly thinking of different ways that we can walk down that road and kind of create a more continuous cycle of evaluation and data gathering and story gathering, not only to demonstrate the impact of the program, but to the earlier point, to understand, needs and improvements looking forward for the gardens.
And we, in Brown County, invitations were sent out to the garden participants, but specifically called, and the conversation was in Hmong or Spanish for those gardeners who speak those languages. And we had the simultaneous interpretation technology, and that worked out fairly well with the so everyone wore a headset in this case, and then we had an interpreter in the room that would translate Hmong to English. Our Spanish participant didn't show up that particular day, so we had someone who was doing simultaneous interpretation, and the headsets worked out fairly well because people then were able to speak in their language and then hear it in their language as well.
Awesome. Well, I think to
Maybe
keep
a
with
last
our
thing to say related to that translation is one of the things that we found in Brown County and Milwaukee County is that understanding people's culture is something that came out of the community garden, and it at least wasn't something that I had exactly expected. One of the stories that we heard was, there's melons that the the Hmong farmers were growing melons. The non-Hmong gardeners were wondering what they were, and there was one left over, so they tried it and they said, "This is an awful melon. Why are you growing it?" And then they learned that they grow the melons for the leaves, not for the melons themselves, and so they gained an understanding and appreciation for that particular culture, which they wouldn't have experienced if they had not been part of the garden.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Patrick and team. I saw in the chat, so I think there's lots of applications. People are thinking about how they can apply ripple effect mapping to other program areas beyond just community gardens, which is a great thing. So I will just remind you that we will send out the recording next week with presentation materials. I think Josset mentioned the report that he would also send out with that email. And my really last reminder is just that we will skip December for ASP webinars, but we'll be back in January. So January 25th at 1 p.m. With building community, recognizing implicit bias and microaggressions as barriers. So I would say have a great holiday. Thank you, Leslie, Josset, Connor, and Patrick for your presentation and information, sharing your expertise. We appreciate it. So have a great rest of your week.